Let's talk about Patrick. Patrick had never had a job, and even though he was 27, his parents were still supporting him. But finally, a day comes when they've had enough of his dependency as well as their own overprotection, so they gave him 3 months to find a job. And Patrick didn't take the threat seriously at first. But when he saw after 10 weeks that his parents weren't bluffing about pushing him out of the nest, he started to look for work earnestly. And even so, he failed. No one had ever taught him the value of doing things for himself, and he had never developed the skills to find a job. His father, as usual, comes to his rescue, calls a friend in the construction business who arranges for Patrick to have a job as a carpenter's assistant. And then on the first day of that job, Patrick was reprimanded for taking a 2-hour lunch break. Then the next morning, he gets an earful from the foreman for leaving his tools outside overnight. Patrick had figured that somebody else was going to collect them. But the incident that got him fired was on the second day when he backed a dump truck into the side of the house that they were building. When the foreman confronted him and asked why he was even driving the truck, since he wasn't authorized to do so, and he'd only been asked to bring in some supplies, Patrick replied, well, I thought it would be easier than carrying all that stuff by myself. Besides, nobody told me not to. So this lesson is going to present some methods of handling problems and misbehavior when they happen in a family, but it's also about something much more basic to the development of a child's ability to survive and thrive in our modern society. It's about responsibility. And we can usually recognize responsible behavior when we see it. And this young man, Patrick, lost his job because he just was not behaving responsibly. But what does that word responsible really mean? And so for active parents, it means 3 things. 1, accepting your own obligations. 2, doing the right thing as the situation calls for it. And 3, accepting accountability for your own actions. So, given a choice, children are usually going to do what they want to do over what they do not want to do. And as obvious as that seems, it's important to acknowledge that part of maturing is learning to postpone gratification. And there are times in all of our lives when we would rather not do something that we feel obligated to do. And responsible parenthood, for instance, is definitely filled with times when we sacrifice our own immediate desires for the long-term benefit of our families. And helping your child understand the need for occasional self-sacrifice is part of teaching them responsibility. And that really just means doing what you're obligated to do before or instead of doing what you would really like to do. Meeting your obligations is a cornerstone of success in any society. And some of these obligations are made consciously between people. Like when you tell your child that you're going to pick them up after school, you are obligated to be there. And other obligations are made implicitly through the roles that we accept in our daily lives. Like the job of parenting, for example, it carries with it a lot of different obligations, like providing food and clothing and shelter and discipline and support. And when a responsible person is unable to fulfill their obligations, they feel bad and they work hard to correct that situation. They don't just blow it off. So teaching our children that there are times when we must sacrifice our own short-term desires for long-term benefits, that's teaching them responsibility. And childhood is filled with opportunities, all types of opportunities, just to teach this lesson. So maybe owning a pet means accepting responsibility for caring for it. Or being on a team means showing up for the practice and the games. And taking music lessons means practicing. And being in a family means doing chores. Being a student means doing homework and studying. Sometimes fulfilling an obligation is not fun. And it's okay to acknowledge that. In fact, when your child has to pass up something fun in order to meet an obligation, acknowledging that it's a bummer can help him feel better about that sacrifice. So, for instance, let's say he has to refuse a party invitation because he's already committed to performing in a school play that day. Let him know that you realize it would be more fun to go to the party, but it takes courage to pass up some of the fun stuff in life for the sake of the obligation. And finally, that his responsible attitude is going to pay off in the long run. Helping our children learn the difference between right and wrong is part of our job as parents. And as children are earning the freedom to make decisions by themselves, they're also taking on the responsibility to do what's right in any given situation. And that's not always easy. So, for example, a lot of adults would readily agree that it's right to obey the law. And we should teach our children to do that. But when Dr. Martin Luther King broke Alabama's segregation laws during the Civil Rights Movement, we recognized his actions as not only responsible, but as morally courageous. And over time, people came to discover that the laws were wrong and Dr. King was right. Doing the right thing is often a lot like spelling. For every rule, there seems to be an exception. So, for example, don't hurt others unless it's in self-defense, or don't lie unless it's a white lie to spare someone's feelings, or work hard but don't be a workaholic. Stand up for your friends unless they're doing something wrong. We want to take the time to talk with our children about real life situations, and that's really just the best way to help them grapple with the nuances of what's right and what's wrong. And asking them, hey, what do you think is the right thing to do? That implies that in your family, you're striving to know what is right and to do it. And when your child does the right thing, be sure to encourage them by acknowledging both the action and the courage that it took. So when your child does the wrong thing, help them to understand why it was wrong and what they could have done differently or what they could do differently next time. Then we want to accept accountability. At the very core of responsibility is this idea that what happens to you is the result of decisions that you make. And rather than accepting this, it's much easier for some people, including our children, to blame their problems on other people or on circumstances or just make excuses. But doing that prevents them from learning to make better decisions in the future. And after all, it wasn't their fault. Why would they think about what they could to do differently next time? So there are, sometimes circumstances beyond people's control. But even then, we still have a choice about how we can improve the circumstance. And that's where the responsibility comes in. So for example, like when Lisa's grades began dropping, she blamed it on her teachers for being boring. And that thinking is not likely to help her to improve her grades, since she can't control her teachers to make them more interesting. But what if she took responsibility for the situation and said to herself, there's a lot of boring stuff in this class, but I want to do well in school, so I better study harder anyway. What can I do to make it more fun? And when the child accepts responsibility for what is happening to them, they're going to learn how to prevent or maybe solve their own problems. So we can look at responsibility as a formula. R equals C plus C. Responsibility equals choice plus consequences. And that formula covers all three aspects of responsibility. Since choice includes the choice to meet or not meet the obligation, and the choice to do either right or wrong, and it's part of the parent's job to help the children learn that the choices do have consequences. And that's one of the most empowering lessons that they can learn in or outside of the classroom.